behind the golden gates of Valdoria Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath and, wow, a storm is brewing that threatens to shatter the very foundation of the ancient monarchy. When Queen Consort Isabel demands that Princess Elena surrender the legendary sapphire crown of Valdoria, a tiara that has been passed down through the royal bloodline for over 300 years, she unknowingly ignites a fire that will consume the palace in ways no one could have predicted. What begins as a simple request for a state ceremony quickly spirals into a battle of wills, family loyalty, and royal protocol that will test the bonds of marriage, motherhood, and monarchy itself. Prince Alexander must choose between his wife's ambitions and his family's honor, while Princess Elena finds herself caught in a web of palace intrigue that threatens everything she holds dear. In a world where a single tiara can topple kingdoms and silence can speak louder than words, the House of Montclair is about to discover that some traditions are worth fighting for, even if it means tearing the royal family apart from within. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Princess Elena carefully made her way through the corridor leading to the royal treasury. Her footsteps echoed softly in the silence, each sound seeming to amplify the weight of the moment she was about to face. For 3 years, she had worn the sapphire crown of Valdoria during state ceremonies, a privilege that came with her marriage to Prince Alexander and her position as the future queen. Today, however, everything was about to change. Elena had received the summons just hours earlier, a formal request from Queen Consort Isabel to meet in the treasury at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. The message had been brief, almost curt, mentioning only that there were important matters regarding royal ceremonial items that required immediate attention. Elena's stomach had twisted with unease as she read the words, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. As she approached the heavy oak doors of the treasury, Elena paused to collect herself. The sapphire crown of Valdoria wasn't just any piece of royal jewelry, it was a symbol of legitimacy, of rightful succession, and of the unbroken chain of monarchy that had ruled the kingdom for centuries. The crown had been worn by every queen and future queen for generations, its deep blue sapphires said to represent the eternal bond between the monarch and the people of Valdoria. Elena pushed open the doors and stepped into the treasury, a room lined with glass cases containing some of the most precious artifacts in the kingdom's history. The crown sat in its place of honor at the center of the room, its sapphires catching the light and throwing tiny blue reflections across the walls. Queen Consort Isabel stood beside the case, her back straight and her expression carefully composed. "Your Highness," Isabel said, turning to face Elena with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for coming so promptly." Elena curtsied respectfully, though something in Isabel's tone made her feel as though she were walking into a trap. "Of course, Your Majesty. How may I be of service?" Isabel moved closer to the crown's display case, her fingers trailing along the edge of the glass. "As you know, the upcoming state gala will be one of the most important ceremonial events of the year. Dignitaries from across the continent will be attending, and it's crucial that everything be perfect." Naturally, Elena agreed, though she couldn't understand where this conversation was heading. "I've already begun preparations for the ceremony. The protocol office has briefed me on the proceedings." "Yes, well, that's precisely what I wanted to discuss with you." Isabel's voice took on a sharper edge, though she maintained her diplomatic smile. "After careful consideration and consultation with the palace advisors, I've decided that it would be more appropriate for me to wear the sapphire crown during the gala." Elena felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. For a moment, she was certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but I'm not sure I understand." Isabel's smile became more pronounced, but there was something cold and calculating behind it. "The crown should be worn by the most senior female member of the royal family during such significant events. As queen consort, that position belongs to me." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Elena's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. The tradition had always been clear: the crown was worn by the future queen, the one who would someday rule alongside the king. It had never been worn by a consort, especially not one who had married into the family. "With respect, Your Majesty," Elena said carefully, "the sapphire crown has traditionally been worn by the heir's wife. The protocol has been established for centuries." Isabel's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Protocols can change, my dear. And sometimes they must change to reflect the current realities of our monarchy. Elena felt a surge of anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't just about a piece of jewelry, this was about her position in the royal family, her future role as queen, and the respect that came with those titles. Isabel was essentially challenging her legitimacy and her right to wear the symbols of royal authority. "I understand your perspective, Your Majesty," Elena said, choosing her words carefully, "but I believe this matter should be discussed with Prince Alexander before any decisions are made." Isabel's laugh was light and dismissive. "Oh, my dear child, I hardly think that's necessary. Alexander has far more pressing matters to attend to than discussions about ceremonial jewelry." The condescension in Isabel's voice was unmistakable now, and Elena felt her patience beginning to wear thin. "Nevertheless, I think it would be appropriate to consult with him." "Elena," Isabel said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested the conversation was over, "I'm not asking for your opinion on this matter. I'm informing you of a decision that has already been made. The crown will be transferred to my possession this afternoon." Elena stared at Isabel in disbelief. The audacity of the woman was staggering. She had just waltzed into the treasury and declared that she was taking possession of one of the most significant symbols of royal authority, as though it were nothing more than a borrowed necklace. "I cannot agree to that," Elena said firmly. "The crown is mine by right, and I will not simply hand it over because you've decided you want to wear it." Isabel's mask of civility finally began to slip, revealing something much more ruthless underneath. "You seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter. Let me be clear, you do not." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elena realized that this confrontation had been planned, orchestrated to put her in an impossible position. If she refused, she would be seen as defiant and disrespectful to the queen consort. If she agreed, she would be surrendering not just the crown, but her dignity and her position in the royal hierarchy. "I will need to speak with my husband about this," Elena said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. Isabel stepped closer, her eyes cold and calculating. "You may speak with whomever you wish, but the decision stands. The crown will be collected from your chambers at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I trust you'll have it ready." With that, Isabel turned and walked toward the treasury doors, leaving Elena standing alone beside the empty display case. As the sound of Isabel's footsteps faded down the corridor, Elena felt a mixture of rage and determination building inside her. This wasn't just about a tiara, this was about respect, tradition, and the future of the monarchy itself. Elena remained in the treasury for several more minutes, staring at the space where the crown had sat for so many years. She thought about all the queens who had worn it before her, the weight of history and tradition that it represented. Isabel might have the authority to make demands, but Elena wasn't going to surrender without a fight. As she finally left the treasury and made her way back through the palace corridors, Elena's mind was already working on her next move. She needed to find Alexander immediately and tell him what had happened. If Isabel thought she could simply steamroll over protocol and tradition to satisfy her own ambitions, she was about to discover just how wrong she could be. The palace seemed different as Elena walked through it now, as though the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of the storm that was about to break. She passed servants and courtiers who nodded respectfully as she went by, unaware that the foundation of everything they believed about royal protocol was being challenged behind closed doors. Elena's destination was Alexander's private study, where he typically spent his mornings reviewing state papers and meeting with advisors. She needed to reach him before Isabel had a chance to present her own version of events. The truth had a way of becoming muddled when it passed through too many hands, and Elena was determined that Alexander would hear the facts directly from her. As she approached the study, Elena could hear voices coming from within Alexander's deep, measured tones and another voice she recognized as belonging to his private secretary. She paused outside the door, suddenly, uncertain about bursting in and disrupting what might be an important meeting. But then, she remembered Isabel's cold smile and the casual way she had dismissed centuries of tradition, and her resolve hardened. Elena knocked firmly on the door and waited for Alexander's invitation to enter. When it came, she pushed open the door and stepped inside, her chin raised and her expression determined. Whatever happened next, she was ready for the fight of her life. Prince Alexander looked up from the documents spread across his desk as Elena entered his study, immediately sensing the tension in her posture and the fire in her eyes. He dismissed his private secretary with a gentle nod, waiting until they were alone before speaking.
"Elena, what's wrong?"
Alexander asked, rising from his chair and moving toward her.
"You look like you've seen a ghost."
Elena closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had rehearsed what she would say during her walk from the treasury, but now that she was face to face with her husband, the words seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Your stepmother has just informed me that she intends to wear the sapphire crown at the state gala," Elena said without preamble.
"She's demanding that I turn it over to her this afternoon." Alexander's expression shifted from concern to confusion, then, to something approaching disbelief. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?"
Elena moved away from the door and began pacing across the study, her hands gesturing as she spoke. "She summoned me to the treasury this morning and told me that as queen consort, she should be the one wearing the crown during important ceremonies. She said the decision had already been made and that I would be expected to comply." Alexander stared at his wife for a long moment, processing what she had told him.
The sapphire crown of Valdoria was more than just ceremonial jewelry, it was a symbol that carried deep meaning in the kingdom's traditions.
For his stepmother to suddenly claim the right to wear it was not just unusual, it was unprecedented.
"That's impossible," Alexander said slowly. "The crown has always been worn by the heir's wife. It's been that way for centuries."
"That's exactly what I told her," Elena replied, her voice rising slightly. But she dismissed it as though tradition meant nothing. She said protocols could change to reflect current realities.
Alexander felt a cold anger beginning to build in his chest.
He had always known that Isabel was ambitious, but he had never imagined she would be bold enough to challenge such fundamental aspects of royal protocol.
The crown wasn't just about prestige, it was about legitimacy and the clear line of succession that kept the monarchy stable. "What else did she say?"
Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. Elena stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. "She made it clear that she wasn't asking for my permission. She was informing me of a decision that had supposedly already been made. When I said I needed to discuss it with you, she implied that you were too busy with more important matters to be bothered with ceremonial jewelry."
The last comment hit Alexander like a physical blow.
The implication that he wouldn't care about such a significant challenge to royal protocol was both insulting and revealing. It suggested that Isabel believed she could manipulate the situation without his knowledge or interference.
"She actually said that?"
Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet now. Those were her exact words.
"And when I told her I couldn't agree to hand over the crown, she made it very clear that she didn't believe I had a choice in the matter."
Alexander moved to the window of his study, looking out over the palace gardens where he had played as a child. His father had remarried when Alexander was already an adult, and, while he had tried to maintain a respectful relationship with Isabel, there had always been an undercurrent of tension. She had never quite accepted that her position as queen consort didn't give her authority over the heir's family.
"What time did she say she expected you to turn over the crown?" Alexander asked.
3 o'clock this afternoon. She said it would be collected from my chambers."
Alexander turned back to Elena, his jaw set with determination. "That's not going to happen."
Elena felt a surge of relief at her husband's words, but she could also see the storm building behind his eyes. Alexander was typically calm and measured in his responses, preferring diplomacy to confrontation. But there were certain lines that, once crossed, would provoke a reaction that few people ever saw.
"What are you going to do?" Elena asked.
Alexander moved to his desk and pressed a button that would summon his private secretary. "I'm going to have a conversation with my stepmother. But first, I want to make sure we understand exactly what we're dealing with." When the secretary entered, Alexander issued a series of rapid instructions. He wanted copies of all protocol documents relating to the sapphire crown, a complete list of everyone who had worn it throughout history, and a private meeting with the palace's chief historian within the hour. As the secretary hurried away to fulfill these requests,
Alexander turned back to Elena. I need you to tell me everything she said, word for word if possible. Every detail could be important.
Elena recounted the conversation in the treasury, paying careful attention to Isabel's tone and demeanor.
As she spoke, Alexander's expression grew darker.
It was becoming clear that this wasn't a spontaneous decision on Isabel's part, it had been planned and calculated.
She mentioned consulting with palace advisors, Alexander noted. Did she say which ones? No, she was vague about that.
But the way she said it made it sound as though there was some kind of official backing for her decision.
Alexander felt his anger intensifying.
The idea that Isabel might have been working behind the scenes to build support for her claim was deeply troubling. If she had indeed consulted with advisors and convinced them to support her position, it would make the situation much more complicated.
A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts.
The palace's chief historian, Dr. Margaret Thornfield, entered the study carrying several thick volumes and looking somewhat puzzled by the urgency of the summons.
Your Highness, Dr. Thornfield said with a curtsy, you wish to see me about the sapphire crown?
Dr. Thornfield, I need you to clarify something for me, Alexander said without preamble.
Has there ever been a precedent for a queen consort wearing the sapphire crown of Valdoria during state ceremonies? The historian's eyebrows rose in surprise.
Your Highness, the crown has been exclusively worn by the wives of heirs to the throne since its creation in 1701. No consort has ever worn it during ceremonial occasions.
Never? Elena asked. Never, Your Highness.
In fact, the distinction has always been considered crucial to maintaining clarity about the line of succession. The crown symbolizes the future of the monarchy, not its present configuration. Alexander felt vindicated by the historian's confirmation, but it also made Isabel's actions even more shocking.
She wasn't just bending tradition, she was attempting to overturn 3 centuries of established protocol. Is there any documentation that might support an alternative interpretation? Alexander asked.
Dr. Thornfield shook her head firmly.
None whatsoever, Your Highness. The protocols are quite explicit.
If anything, there are additional documents that reinforce the crown's significance as a symbol of future queenship. After dismissing Dr. Thornfield with instructions to prepare a formal historical brief on the crown's significance, Alexander turned to Elena with a grim expression.
This isn't about tradition or protocol, he said. This is about power.
Isabel is testing the boundaries of her authority and seeing how far she can push before someone pushes back.
Elena felt a chill run down her spine. What do you think she's really trying to accomplish?
I think she's trying to establish herself as the senior female member of the royal family in a way that undermines your position.
If she can successfully claim the right to wear your crown, what else might she claim the right to do? The implications were staggering.
Elena realized that this confrontation over the crown might just be the opening move in a larger campaign to reshape the palace hierarchy. Isabel might be positioning herself to have more influence over royal decisions, ceremonial protocols, and even matters of succession.
So what's our next step? Elena asked. Alexander's expression hardened with resolve.
I'm going to pay a visit to the queen consort and make it very clear that her request is denied.
But I want you to stay away from your chambers this afternoon. If she sends someone to collect the crown, I want them to find nothing. Elena felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension.
She was glad that Alexander was taking a firm stand, but she also knew that this confrontation would have far-reaching consequences for all of them. As if reading her thoughts, Alexander moved closer and took her hands in his.
Elena, I need you to understand something. This fight isn't just about a piece of jewelry.
It's about respect, tradition, and the future of our monarchy.
Isabel has chosen to challenge something fundamental, and if we don't respond decisively, it won't be the last time.
Elena squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his conviction.
I understand. What do you need me to do? For now, I need you to trust me and let me handle this.
But be prepared, things are about to get very uncomfortable around here. As Elena left the study, Alexander remained behind, staring out the window at the palace grounds. In a few hours, he would have a conversation with Isabel that would likely change the dynamics of the royal family forever. He only hoped that when the dust settled, the monarchy would emerge stronger rather than irreparably damaged. At precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, Prince Alexander made his way through the palace corridors toward Queen Consort Isabel's private apartments. Word had already spread through the household staff that something significant was brewing. His servants moved with unusual haste through the halls, and there was a tension in the air that even the most junior members of the household could feel. Alexander had spent the previous hour reviewing historical documents and consulting with legal advisors about royal protocol. Every piece of evidence confirmed what he already knew: Isabel's demand was not just unprecedented, it was fundamentally wrong. But he also understood that this confrontation was about much more than historical precedent. As he approached Isabel's receiving room, Alexander was announced by her personal secretary. He entered to find his stepmother seated in an ornate chair, dressed impeccably and wearing an expression of serene confidence. She rose gracefully as he entered, but there was something in her posture that suggested she had been expecting this visit. "Alexander, how wonderful to see you," Isabel said, her voice warm and welcoming. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" Alexander didn't accept the invitation to sit that she offered with a gesture. Instead, he remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that his military training had ingrained in him when dealing with serious matters. "I think you know why I'm here, Isabel," Alexander said, his voice steady but cool. "I understand you had an interesting conversation with my wife this morning." Isabel's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes. "Ah yes, the matter of the ceremonial arrangements for the state gala. I trust Elena explained the situation to you?" "She explained that you demanded she surrender the sapphire crown of Valdoria to you," Alexander replied. What she couldn't explain was the reasoning behind such an extraordinary request. Isabel moved to a side table where tea had been laid out, her movements deliberately casual as though they were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "I hardly think it's extraordinary, Alexander. As queen consort, it's appropriate for me to take a more prominent role in important state ceremonies." "The crown has never been worn by a consort," Alexander said, his voice growing harder. "Not once in 300 years. Isabel poured herself a cup of tea, taking her time with the ritual before responding. "Perhaps it's time for new traditions. The monarchy must evolve with the times, don't you think?" Alexander felt his patience beginning to fray. Isabel's casual dismissal of centuries of protocol was insulting, but her pretense that this was somehow in the monarchy's best interests was infuriating. "This has nothing to do with evolution or modernization," Alexander said sharply. "This is about you overstepping your authority and attempting to claim privileges that don't belong to you." For the first time, Isabel's composure showed a crack. Her teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down, and, when she looked up at Alexander, the warmth had vanished from her expression. "I'm afraid I don't appreciate your tone, Alexander," she said coolly. "I am still your father's wife and the queen consort of this realm." "And I am the heir to the throne," Alexander replied, his voice rising slightly. "The crown belongs to my wife, not to you. That's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of law and tradition." Isabel stood and moved closer to Alexander, her chin raised defiantly. "The law can be interpreted in many ways, and traditions can be modified when circumstances require it." "What circumstances?" Alexander demanded. "What possible justification could you have for claiming Elena's crown?" Isabel's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculation and ambition that had been driving her actions. "Elena is young and inexperienced. She lacks the gravitas necessary for such important occasions. The visiting dignitaries expect to see maturity and wisdom embodied in our ceremonial practices." Alexander stared at his stepmother in disbelief. "You're questioning my wife's fitness to perform her royal duties?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps she isn't ready for such significant responsibilities," Isabel replied, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. "There's no shame in that, she simply needs more time to grow into her role." The insult was so blatant and outrageous that Alexander felt his carefully maintained composure finally snap. "How dare you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. How dare you question my wife's capabilities or suggest that she isn't worthy of her position? Isabel seemed surprised by the intensity of his reaction, but she pressed forward.
Alexander, you're being emotional about this.
I'm simply trying to do what's best for the monarchy.
What's best for the monarchy?
Alexander's voice was rising now, and anyone passing in the corridor outside would have been able to hear it. What's best for the monarchy is maintaining the traditions and protocols that have kept it stable for centuries, not allowing ambitious individuals to reshape it for their own benefit.
The accusation of ambition hit its mark.
Isabel's face flushed with anger, and she abandoned any pretense of diplomatic language.
I have served this family faithfully for years, she snapped.
I have supported your father through difficult times and represented the crown with dignity. I deserve to be treated with the respect that my position commands.
Respect is earned, not demanded, Alexander shot back.
And you certainly haven't earned the right to claim my wife's crown or to question her fitness for her role. The argument was escalating rapidly, with both participants abandoning the careful diplomatic language that usually governed royal family interactions. Alexander's military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but Isabel's attacks on Elena had touched a nerve that rarely saw the light of day. You're making a mistake, Alexander, Isabel said, her voice cold and threatening. There are ways to ensure that proper protocol is followed, with or without your cooperation. Alexander stepped closer to his stepmother, his eyes flashing with anger.
Are you threatening me?
I'm simply pointing out that the palace has procedures for resolving disputes about ceremonial matters, Isabel replied.
If necessary, the matter could be referred to the Royal Protocol Committee. Alexander felt a surge of fury at the suggestion.
The idea that Isabel would try to use bureaucratic procedures to override clear tradition and his direct authority was almost beyond comprehension. Let me make something absolutely clear, Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet.
The crown stays with my wife.
There will be no committee review, no protocol dispute, and no further discussion.
If you attempt to circumvent my authority on this matter, you will discover just how unpleasant I can make things for you.
Isabel's eyes widened at the explicit threat, but she wasn't ready to back down completely.
Your father won't approve of you speaking to me this way. My father will support the maintenance of proper royal protocol, Alexander replied confidently.
And if you think otherwise, you're welcome to discuss this matter with him. The mention of the king seemed to give Isabel pause. She had assumed that she could resolve this matter quietly, without involving her husband in what she had hoped would be a simple assertion of authority. The prospect of having to explain her actions to the king was clearly not appealing.
Alexander sensed her hesitation and pressed his advantage. The crown will remain in Elena's possession, where it belongs. Any attempt to collect it from her chambers will be treated as theft of royal property. With that declaration, Alexander turned and strode toward the door, leaving Isabel standing alone in her receiving room.
As he walked through the palace corridors, he could feel the eyes of servants and courtiers following him, sensing that something significant had just occurred. But Alexander's victory in the confrontation with Isabel was only the beginning. He knew that his stepmother was not the type of person to accept defeat gracefully, and he suspected that this battle over the crown would escalate in ways that none of them could fully predict. As he made his way back to his own apartments, Alexander's mind was already working on the next phase of this conflict.
If Isabel wanted a fight, she was certainly going to get one.
News of the explosive confrontation between Prince Alexander and Queen Consort Isabel spread through Valdoria Palace like wildfire. By evening, every servant, courtier, and advisor in the royal household was aware that something unprecedented had occurred, though the exact details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story. In the servants' quarters, whispered conversations spoke of shouting that could be heard through the walls of the queen consort's apartments. In the administrative offices, clerks speculated about potential changes to ceremonial protocols. And, in the private chambers of various noble families who maintained residences at the palace, urgent discussions were taking place about the implications of what appeared to be an open rift in the royal family. Princess Elena had spent the afternoon in the palace gardens, accompanied by her lady-in-waiting, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while waiting for news of Alexander's confrontation with Isabel. When a footman finally found her with a message that the prince requested her presence in their private apartments, she felt her stomach clench with anticipation. She found Alexander in their sitting room, standing by the fireplace and staring into the flames. His formal jacket had been discarded, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, sure signs that the afternoon had been more stressful than usual.
"How did it go?" Elena asked softly, closing the door behind her.
Alexander turned to face her, and Elena could immediately see the tension in his expression. "About as well as could be expected," he replied grimly. "She's not going to back down easily." Elena moved to the sofa and settled beside her husband as he joined her.
"Tell me what happened."
Alexander recounted the confrontation in detail, describing Isabel's attempts to justify her claim and her insulting suggestions about Elena's fitness for royal duties. As he spoke, Elena felt her own anger building, but she also felt a deep gratitude for Alexander's fierce defense of her position.
"She actually said I was too young and inexperienced?" Elena asked when Alexander finished his account.
Those were her exact words. Along with suggestions that the visiting dignitaries would expect to see more maturity and wisdom during the ceremony. Elena felt tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "She's trying to undermine everything I've worked for since joining this family. Every protocol I've learned, every ceremony I've participated in, every relationship I've built with foreign dignitaries, she wants to sweep it all aside as though it means nothing." Alexander took her hands in his anger rekindling as he saw the pain in his wife's eyes.
"That's exactly what she's trying to do. This isn't about the crown, it's about establishing dominance and pushing you out of the spotlight."
As they sat together, both lost in their thoughts about the implications of the day's events, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation.
Alexander's private secretary entered with a message that would change everything.
"Your Highness," the secretary said, his voice carefully neutral, "His Majesty requests your presence in his study immediately."
Alexander felt his stomach drop.
The summons from his father could only mean one thing: Isabel had followed through on her threat to escalate the matter. The king had been drawn into the conflict, exactly as Alexander had hoped to avoid.
"Did His Majesty indicate the nature of the meeting?" Alexander asked.
"No, Your Highness, but Queen Consort Isabel is already with him."
Alexander exchanged a meaningful look with Elena.
They both understood that the next hour would likely determine how this conflict would be resolved, and whether their marriage would survive the political machinations of the palace. "I should go with you," Elena said, rising from the sofa.
Alexander shook his head. "No. This is something I need to handle alone."
"If my father wanted to speak with both of us, he would have requested it." Elena wanted to argue, but she recognized the wisdom in Alexander's decision. The dynamics between Alexander, his father, and his stepmother were complicated enough without adding another variable to the mix.
Alexander kissed his wife's forehead and straightened his appearance before making the journey to his father's study.
As he walked through the palace corridors, he mentally prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. King Frederick of Valdoria was seated behind his massive oak desk when Alexander entered the study, with Queen Consort Isabel positioned in one of the chairs facing the king. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and Alexander could immediately sense that his stepmother had been presenting her version of events for some time.
"Alexander," the king said without preamble, "please sit down. We need to discuss the events of this afternoon."
Alexander took the chair beside Isabel, noting that she avoided making eye contact with him. Her posture was perfectly composed, but he could detect subtle signs of nervousness in the way her hands were clasped in her lap. "Isabel has informed me that there was some kind of disagreement about ceremonial arrangements for the state gala," King Frederick continued. "She also mentioned that you spoke to her in a manner that was, shall we say, less than respectful."
Alexander felt his jaw tighten.
Isabel had obviously presented the situation in a way that made him appear to be the aggressor while positioning herself as the victim of his unreasonable behavior. "Your Majesty," Alexander began carefully, "there was indeed a disagreement, but it wasn't about ceremonial arrangements in general."
Isabel demanded that Elena surrender the sapphire crown of Valdoria so that she could wear it during the gala. King Frederick's eyebrows rose in surprise. "The sapphire crown?"
But, that's traditionally worn by the wife of the heir to the throne, Alexander finished.
Exactly.
There's no precedent for a consort wearing it, and the historical documents are absolutely clear on this point. The king turned to look at his wife, and Alexander could see confusion in his expression.
Isabel, you didn't mention anything about the crown specifically. For the first time since Alexander had entered the room, Isabel showed signs of discomfort.
I thought it would be more appropriate to discuss the broader issues of ceremonial precedence, she said carefully.
The broader issues? Alexander's voice was sharp with anger.
You told my wife that she was too young and inexperienced to wear the crown. You questioned her fitness for royal duties and suggested that foreign dignitaries would expect to see someone with more maturity and wisdom. King Frederick's expression darkened as he absorbed this information.
You said that about Elena?
Isabel's composure was beginning to crack under the weight of having her words repeated in front of her husband. I simply suggested that perhaps someone with more experience should take the lead during such an important ceremony. Elena has been performing royal duties flawlessly for 3 years, the king said, his voice growing colder. She has represented our family with dignity and grace at dozens of state functions. Alexander felt a surge of gratitude toward his father for defending Elena, but he could also see that Isabel was not going to give up without a fight. Your Majesty, Isabel said, her voice taking on a pleading tone, I was only thinking of what would be best for the monarchy.
Surely the senior female member of the royal family should take precedence during the most important ceremonies?
King Frederick stood up from his desk and moved to the window, his back to both Alexander and Isabel. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority.
The sapphire crown of Valdoria will be worn by Princess Elena during the state gala, as tradition dictates, he declared. There will be no further discussion of this matter.
Alexander felt relief wash over him, but he could see that Isabel was not prepared to accept defeat. Frederick, she began, but the king cut her off with a sharp gesture.
The matter is closed, Isabel.
You will offer your apologies to both Alexander and Elena for questioning protocol that has been established for centuries.
The humiliation was complete.
Isabel had not only failed to get her way, but she had been publicly rebuked by her husband in front of his son. Alexander could see the fury building behind her carefully controlled expression, and he knew that this defeat would not be forgotten or forgiven. As the meeting concluded and Alexander made his way back to Elena, he felt both victorious and apprehensive. They had won this battle, but the war for influence and respect within the royal family was far from over. The aftermath of King Frederick's decisive intervention created an atmosphere of uneasy tension that permeated every corner of Valdoria Palace. In the days following the confrontation, Queen Consort Isabel maintained a facade of gracious acceptance, but those who knew her well could detect the simmering resentment beneath her carefully composed exterior. Princess Elena had emerged from the crisis with her position secure, but she found herself navigating a dramatically changed landscape within the royal household. Isabel's public apology, delivered in the presence of several senior courtiers, had been perfectly worded and utterly insincere. Every syllable dripped with barely concealed hostility, making it clear that while the battle had been lost, Isabel's war for influence was far from over. The lead-up to the state gala became a careful dance of protocol and politics. Elena threw herself into preparations with renewed determination, working closely with the palace staff to ensure that every detail of the ceremony would be flawless. She understood that all eyes would be on her during the event, watching for any sign of weakness or uncertainty that might validate Isabel's earlier criticisms. 3 days before the gala, Elena stood in her dressing room as the royal seamstresses made final adjustments to her ceremonial gown. The sapphire crown of Valdoria rested in its case nearby, its deep blue stones catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. As she looked at the crown, Elena reflected on how much her understanding of royal life had changed in just a few short days. Your Highness, her lady-in-waiting, Lady Catherine, said softly, there's been talk among the staff about the ceremony. They're all very excited to see you wear the crown again.
Elena smiled at the genuine affection in Catherine's voice.
The palace staff had watched the recent drama unfold with intense interest, and their support for Elena had been both touching and valuable.
In the complex ecosystem of royal politics, having the household staff on one side could make an enormous difference.
I'm honored by their support, Elena replied. Though I confess, I feel the weight of their expectations along with the weight of the crown itself. Lady Catherine helped Elena step down from the fitting platform, careful not to disturb the intricate beadwork on the gown. If I may say so, Your Highness, you've handled this entire situation with remarkable grace. Many in your position might have been tempted to respond with anger or vindictiveness.
Elena considered this observation as she changed back into her everyday clothes.
It was true that she could have made Isabel's position much more difficult if she had chosen to do so. She could have spoken to foreign dignitaries about the attempted usurpation, or leaked details of the confrontation to the press. Instead, she had chosen to maintain her dignity and let the strength of tradition speak for itself. Grace is sometimes the most powerful weapon we have, Elena said thoughtfully. Isabel expected me to react emotionally, to give her ammunition for her claims about my unsuitability. By refusing to do so, I think I may have frustrated her more than any direct retaliation could have. As if summoned by their conversation, a footman appeared at the door with word that Queen Consort Isabel wished to speak with Princess Elena privately. Elena felt her stomach tighten, but she agreed to the meeting, curious about what Isabel might want to discuss now that the matter had been officially settled. The meeting took place in one of the palace's smaller reception rooms, decorated with portraits of previous monarchs who seemed to watch over the proceedings with stern expressions. Isabel was waiting when Elena arrived, dressed impeccably as always but showing subtle signs of the stress she had been under. Elena, thank you for agreeing to see me, Isabel began, her voice carefully neutral. I wanted to speak with you before the gala. Elena took a seat across from Isabel, maintaining the respectful posture that protocol demanded while remaining alert for any signs of renewed hostility.
Of course, Your Majesty. How can I help you?
Isabel seemed to struggle with her words for a moment before continuing. I owe you a more sincere apology than the one I was required to give publicly. My behavior was inappropriate, and my comments about your capabilities were unfair and unfounded. Elena was surprised by what appeared to be genuine contrition, but she remained cautious.
I appreciate you saying that, Your Majesty. I want you to understand, Isabel continued, that my actions weren't motivated by any personal animosity toward you.
You've been nothing but gracious and respectful since joining this family. Elena waited for Isabel to continue, sensing that there was more to this conversation than a simple apology. The truth is, Isabel said, her voice dropping slightly, I've been struggling with my role in this family since Frederick and I married. As a consort rather than a queen in my own right, I sometimes feel overlooked. When I saw the opportunity to take a more prominent role during the gala, I seized it without properly considering the implications.
The admission was startling in its honesty.
Elena began to see Isabel not as a calculating schemer, but as a woman grappling with her own insecurities and ambitions within the rigid structure of royal hierarchy. I can understand that struggle, Elena said carefully.
The protocols and traditions can feel confining sometimes.
Isabel looked up with something approaching gratitude in her eyes.
Exactly.
But I realize now that I went about addressing those feelings in entirely the wrong way. By challenging your position, I was trying to elevate my own, and that was neither fair nor wise. Elena felt a complex mix of emotions, sympathy for Isabel's position, relief at the apparent sincerity of her apology, but also wariness about letting her guard down too completely. What matters now is that we move forward in a way that serves the monarchy and maintains family harmony, Elena said diplomatically.
Agreed, Isabel replied. And I want you to know that you'll have my full support during the gala and beyond. You've earned the right to wear that crown, and you'll wear it with more grace than I ever could have.
As Elena left the meeting, she felt cautiously optimistic about the future of her relationship with Isabel. The conversation had revealed depths and vulnerabilities that she hadn't expected, suggesting that perhaps their conflict had been based more on misunderstanding and insecurity than genuine malice. The state gala itself proved to be a triumph for both Elena and the royal family as a whole. As she walked into the grand ballroom wearing the sapphire crown of Valdoria, Elena felt the weight of history and tradition supporting her every step. The foreign dignitaries who had come to pay their respects to the kingdom were clearly impressed by the pageantry and protocol, and Elena's performance throughout the evening was flawless. From her position near the royal family's table, Queen Consort Isabel watched Elena's graceful interactions with visiting heads of state and diplomats. There was no trace of resentment or envy in her expression, only what appeared to be genuine admiration for Elena's poise and diplomatic skills. Prince Alexander, standing beside his wife during the formal presentations, felt an enormous sense of pride and relief. The crisis that had threatened to tear his family apart had been resolved, and Elena had emerged not just victorious, but strengthened by the experience. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself reflecting on the lessons learned from the entire ordeal. The monarchy's strength came not just from its traditions and protocols, but from the character of those who upheld them. Elena's grace under pressure, his father's decisive leadership, and even Isabel's eventual recognition of her mistakes had all contributed to a resolution that preserved both the institution and the family relationships within it. The sapphire crown of Valdoria continued to rest securely on Elena's head throughout the evening, its blue stones catching the light from the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. But, more than just a symbol of royal authority, the crown had become a reminder of the importance of standing firm in defense of principle while remaining open to understanding and forgiveness. As the gala drew to a close and the royal family prepared to retire for the evening, there was a sense that the House of Montclair had weathered its storm and emerged stronger. The traditions that had guided the kingdom for centuries remained intact, but the people who embodied those traditions had grown in wisdom and understanding. In the end, the crown had stayed exactly where it belonged, not just on Elena's head, but within a family that had learned to balance respect for tradition with compassion for human frailty. The monarchy would continue, strengthened by the knowledge that its foundations could withstand even the most serious challenges from within.